Welcome to Mystara, boys and girls. This week is a new take on the channel as I'm almost out of Mystara products, and I'm going to look into the deep meta of the setting. First and foremost, I have to talk about what went wrong with Wrath of the Immortals. If you haven't seen that video review yet, and you are unfamiliar with the book, go check it out so you'll understand the references. This book is by far the most controversial of the books because of the massive changes to the setting, and most people I've talked with about it either disregard it or change it. Well, this week I am talking about how to warp the official timeline for the better using foul magics like an enchantress from the darkest part of Blackheart. I'm Mr. Welch, and let's fix Wrath of the Immortals. To give you some backstory, in the early 90s with the creation of 2nd edition, TSR decided to reboot all their core lines to bring them up to par with the new rules. Also to get rid of anything remotely Gygax related, but that's another story. Dragonlance was immune to the purge because the Hickmans did have some degree of creative control. Spelljammer was dead, Dark Sun was just beginning, Birthright was years away, and Eberron came out in 3rd edition, leaving just 4 settings to get nuked. The results were varied. Forgotten Realms got the Time of Troubles, Greyhawk getting the Greyhawk Wars, Ravenloft had the Grand Conjunction, and Mystara got Wrath of the Immortals. As far as the setting reboots go, Mystara got the short end of the stick and probably the worst setting reboot until Forgotten Realms got hit with the despised Spell Plague. Greyhawk got a much-needed shaking up of its stagnant storyline, and Forgotten Realms got turned into a moneymaker, though the related modules to the Time of Trouble still aren't that well regarded. Ravenloft's Grand Conjunction was considered kind of a neutral thing because it rearranged the map, but it's Ravenloft. If the Dark Lord doesn't want you leaving, it doesn't matter who your neighbor is, you're not getting out. So what did Wrath do to make it a base breaker? Well, it largely got rid of the one thing Mystara did better than all the other settings. It was in the middle of a cold war between militant Thyatis and magical Alphatia. Every other nation had their fate tied to those nations because if they went at it, everybody else would have been drawn in. Wrath turns the Cold War hot, and at the end of it, Thyatis is a broken shell, and Alphatia has been whisked away to the Hollow World. The Cold War was gone. Neither of the empires were a threat anymore. The only surviving empire won by Deus Ex Machina, and it was so crippled that no one else was concerned about it. Then you throw in all the other changes that the players had no agency at all to stop. A good chunk of Glantri was nuked by a poorly aimed meteor. Alfheim was taken over by the Shadow Elves in the background while the party sat around and did nothing because they were too busy running the Immortals' fury. Von Hendricks and Embargo, the long-hated enemies of most basic-level adventurers, got run out of town by NPCs. That's a lot of plot ramrodded through by Fiat while the party runs around doing fetch quests. Wrath hit right after the Gazetteer series had come to an end. TSR felt long-running series were bad for business and put an end to that line after Book 14. The BECM part of BECME got its well-earned revision in the Rule Cyclopedia. The Immortals section was retuned into Wrath of the Immortals, and that part of the book was largely seen as necessary. But that's where the love generally stops. A large number of the Mystara fanbase I talked to say that the end of the Gazetteer series should have been the start of the Mystara line rather than the time to reboot it. You've just established the background for the major nations in the area. Now you start writing modules and supplements about them. But TSR was going through a major shakeup, and they decided everybody had to get a nuke dropped on them. So chalk that one up to biggest missed opportunity TSR had as far as Mystara was concerned. The events of the Immortals' Fury stripped away most of the tension that Mystara had brewing. The timeline that was continued for 3 more years with the Almanacs had little to do in the way of international conflict, as all the nations had either failed at conquest or nearly imploded from internal strife. The Ethengar failed at the invasion of Heldan. Thyatis' attempt to take over what was left of Alphatia failed. Glantri lost almost half of its princes, and it turned the nation, wrought with divisive politics, into a singular plotline involving a new evil princess taking over the nation. Karamikos became much more stable and civilized, with Alfheim elves settling in the wilder parts and Von Hendricks getting the boot. Alfheim got conquered. Instead of her allies immediately driving out the Shadow Elves, nothing happens. The Shadow Elves just decide to become insular and not interact with any other nation. That's boring. There's a lot of ways to alter the events of the Immortals' Fury in your storyline, but if you want to ignore it, that's an option. Your campaign is yours alone. But if you wanted to write new adventures or new guides and wanted to justify breaking away from the 1010 timeline, there's a lot of ways to do it. The first option I thought of was probably the worst way to normally retcon a setting, and that's time travel. However, with Mystara, that's always been an option. Time travel figures heavily into the setting. The Sphere of Time has numerous artifacts that allow it. One of the paths of immortality requires it. Even the Blackmore series gives you an out with the comeback in being a giant doorway in time. So there is precedent. Have the party go back and work to counter the machinations of the Immortals that caused the whole mess in the first place. Any one of the Immortals of time, like Coronis or Tempest, or patrons of Alphatia, like the immortal Alphatia herself, could try to reverse the results. The party would have to get to Glantri before Rad could turn on his doomsday device, preventing the destruction of Alphatia, but that would be an awesome module. There's 4 problems Wrath created that would need to be addressed if you wanted to advance the timeline but not nuke the setting. The majority of the changes in Mystara happened around 1005, so that's where I would focus. First, you've got the War of the Spheres that emasculates Thyatis and effectively destroys Alphatia. This got rid of all the politicking and alliance building between the 2 empires and the rest of the setting. Then you've got the destruction of Alfheim by the Shadow Elves. Biggest issues with that is they didn't do anything with the Shadow Elves, as they became isolationists in their own nation and never played a major role in the setting after that. Von Hendricks gets chased out of Karamikos as a minor gripe, but that should have been left for the players to do. Then you got Glantri getting nuked from orbit with a meteor, and almost half the princes getting killed or turning into ravening madmen in the process. So you got your work cut out for you. Now, Alphatia did need to be brought down a peg. That's not a secret. The way it was written was over the top, with 1,000 maximum level wizards serving as a ruling council. That was a bit much. If that were the case, the Empire could have destroyed Thyatis, Glantri, and everything in between without much of a fight. There's 2 ways to rein them in that became obvious. First, you can make that claim pure propaganda. The nation is chaotic in nature, so while they might have 1,000 high-level wizards, they would all be scatterbrained and uncaring about what happens outside their own libraries. Alphatia would become the worst part of libertarian theory, with everyone not caring about anything that doesn't immediately impact them. So while Alphatia brags about its massive magical powers, the nation itself is too fragmented to work. The other way to do it is really easy because it's kind of already written into the plot. And that's with the death of General Torinal early in the adventure. Give the military to Crown Prince Xandar. He's the definition of useless, as he refused to believe anyone is as qualified or as smart or as good as him. This guy makes Gaston look reasonable and level-headed. While he wouldn't have command of the armies for long, because his mother isn't a moron, he could easily do enough damage getting their armies massacred by the better organized and led Thyacian legions that any advantage Alphatia had would soon be squandered. The war ends in a stalemate, and Ariadne secretly looking for a new crown prince, and the Empire wondering if they are really the ones on top. Plus, if you go with that storyline, you add a bit more tension, because then Alphatia realizes that the way its government does new leaders isn't going to work, because their next apparent leader is more than likely going to get them all killed in a massive civil war, when a large number of the Alphatian kingdoms go into open revolt when it's revealed that their new emperor is a gigantic magic-using man-child. Thyatis, on the other hand, really needs a win. In the module, they are nearly obliterated because Alphatia is just so much better than them. That raises the question, if Alphatia was so much better than Thyatis all along, why were they holding back in the first place? So Alphatia gets taken down a peg while Thyatis gets some love. Turn Thincall or his #1 unnamed general into a tactical genius. Thyatis actually holds its own against Alphatia, winning in some theaters of war, while Alphatia just goes after Glantri mostly. Or kill off Emperor Thincall, like he does die in the timeline, and have his son Eusebius be just as cunning as his father, and now Eusebius is pissed as well. Establish Thyatis as a legitimate threat to Alphatia, so when the war is over, the Cold War is just as strong, as both sides know a massive war between them is completely pointless. Alfheim is always a bit of a sore spot, because a lot of players love their elves, and the nation gets taken down without so much as a whimper. The Alfheim clans go live in other nations, and now the Shadow Elves shut the doors behind them and lock it. Again, that's boring. Considering most of the parties would have an elf, and elves tend to come from, or at least come from areas that are friendly with Alfheim, you better believe an invasion by Shadow Elves would have brought a harsh reprisal from the party. Imagine making a character with a long history and a background tied to Waterdeep, for example, and as soon as the campaign starts, you drop a meteor on Waterdeep, killing everyone, while your character's off fighting orcs in Featherdale. Now imagine the death glare you're going to get from that player as you have just wiped out his hometown and probably all the stuff that he kept there. If you want to change the invasion and everything that happened, you can easily just not have the invasion take place, or just have it get defeated. Alfheim has a ton of allies. There's Darrakin, the Five Shires, and Karamikos. Even Glantri would help them, and none of them would be too happy with one of their closest allies suddenly getting conquered. Even Rockholm would frown on the Ponzi elves living next door getting kicked out suddenly by the Mopey elves, whose their initial act as a new kingdom was to invade and conquer a sovereign nation. That's going to make for a lot of nervous neighbors. Now, if you want to amp up the tension in Mystara, have the Shadow Elves go after the Broken Lands instead of Alfheim. It does make sense. It's directly over the legendary city of Angmar. With some magic and possibly a little help from some others, you could have the nation of New Angmar spout up right out of the ground in the Broken Lands, just miles away from Alfheim. Now you've got two rival elven nations almost bordering each other and having to play nice because the country between them doesn't want Alfheim and New Angmar tearing at each other's throats because Darrican would quite literally be caught in the middle. Now, when it comes to Von Hendricks Embargo, my biggest complaint, well, not mine, this is actually one of the biggest complaints from a lot of people, they're too good of a villain to run off. There's a reason why Blofeld in James Bond kept surviving to the next movie. Never waste a good bad guy. Above all else, let the players be the one to serve justice on these twos, not some random background event. My setting gave him a family just as evil as he was, so he became ingrained in the politics of the nation while they were plotting against the Duke while having to maintain his image. You can do the same thing. Don't get rid of the Baron in the background. Change for change's sake is not necessarily a good thing. In the official timeline, he's replaced by some kid who turns out to be incompetent but not malicious. Incompetency does not replace proper villainy in a storyline. If you've got a good villain, stick with him until it's time to end the arc properly. The Baron is a great villain, and replacing a great villain with a mediocre villain will hurt a story. It's like in Luke Cage, the TV show, when they killed off Cottonmouth halfway through to introduce us to Diamondback, who was just a goon and much less interesting. Good villains are destined to meet their fate at the hands of the heroes, not just catch a stray bullet from a random mook in the middle of the fight. Don't cheat your players on this one, trust me. Glantri getting nuked is one of the hardest to deal with because if you want to keep the Sin storyline, and it's a decent storyline, you're going to have to let some of the princes go. The fact that Glantri, after getting nuked by the Master, then allies with Thar's legions is a massive head-scratcher for a lot of the Mystara fans. It's like Switzerland having a massive earthquake and deciding the best person to help with the rebuild would be Hitler. Pretty sure if you asked around, you might be able to find some contractors that are a little less murdery to help you with the rebuild. And the decision to invite in all the humanoids that you've been at war with for decades just seems so random. Now, that being said, Etienne needs to go, at least temporarily. He's immortal, so if you want to go with Sin, he can't be there because he'll spot her immediately for what she is. Since Sin replaces Volasphere, or at least uses his name to get herself made princess, he's going to have to go as well. If you want to keep Demalapetri or Velarden alive, that's up to you. But remember, with Demalapetri, never waste a good villain. But you have to keep the massive amount of internal politics. That's what made Glantri so memorable. Killing off half the princes and making everyone else just fall into the pro or anti-Sin faction destroys what makes Glantri Glantri. Don't boil the best-written Machiavellian setting written devolve into a he-said-she-said drama. If you want to keep the Cold War intact, that opens up a large number of options for the players to get involved in. With both Thyatis and Alphatia financially spent, that means it's going to be a trade war between Darrican and Minrathad to help rebuild. You've got laissez-faire Darrican trying to win a war with fair play and diplomacy versus crony-capitalistic Minrathad with their dirty tricks and their monopolies. This would let you introduce the nation of Sind as it rebuilds from the Master's invasion, while Minrathad explores the southern and eastern lands only hinted at in some of the books. Then the two nations behind the scenes start hiring mercenaries and privateers, and you've got a brand new pseudo-war all in the name of gold. And of course, the party is right there standing in line for a paycheck. The biggest complaint with the changes were they turned Mystara into just another generic setting. Glantri lost everything that made it special because, first off, they started to allow clerics in, so the rampant racism is just gone. Stagnation set in with the meta plot, and it became about various NPCs going around adventuring and the parties reading about that later. I'm not saying change is a bad thing in a plot, far from it, but rapid change can eradicate the parts of a setting that made it interesting in the first place. If your character came from Alphatia, Alfheim, or one of the two nuked Glantri principalities, imagine how you would feel if your homeland got vaporized or conquered. There was nothing your hero could do about it. Wrath took a massive amount of conflict out of the game. Going back to 1005 and letting the player stop the setting from being nuked lets you rewrite it from where most people felt it went wrong. Plus a time travel adventure where you see the devastation Wrath brings and you send back the party to stop the destruction before it happens would be a great way to restart the setting just in time for 5th edition to open up the DM's Guild so we can start publishing. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. So that's my take on what went wrong with Wrath and how to undo it. Your campaign is your campaign, and if you don't mind the changes, good on you. If you feel like a lot of people that the module was a heavy-handed railroad, just give your characters more agency to change it. Let them decide what happens in the setting rather than just saying rock falls, everybody in Black Hill dies. That will at least clear up a massive amount of continuity errors that the module caused. Now, next week, I'm knocking out the rest of the Hollow World setting books, starting with the Millennium Empire. There's only 6 books left that I haven't reviewed, and then I go meta on how to play in Mystara, or clarify its place in the multiverse, or even fix some of the continuity errors if I ever have a few spare hours of time. But let's finish off the half dozen books remaining, and then I can freestyle it. So until next time, life is too short to play bad modules.